I figured out that the system that I lived in was actually contradicting the basic human nature. You know, the love for children, affection, people's affection to each other. Then I was faced with a choice whether I should side with the system or with human nature. So I chose human nature. Then I came to the United States, hoping to live in a society that is ruled by reason and common sense, and live decently as a normal human being raising a family. And ironically, I wound up living in New York. And I was fooled again there at the second time, reading the New York Times and listening to the NPR local station. And I had no idea what was really going on until 9/11 happened, which I learned from the very from the tower, from Fulton Street. I saw how the towers fell. That was such a big shock to me, and I realized that life would never be the same. There would be some serious changes in the entire geopolitical system with that. And then some of my friends, or people who I thought were my friends, were starting telling me about America's fault in all this, that it was basically, it called it on itself. And I was telling them, you have no idea what you're talking about. You haven't lived in other countries. You haven't met people who hate America, haven't listened to that anti-American propaganda that penetrated the world throughout all the years of the Cold War. And that propaganda was mostly manufactured. It was like a virus that was spreading. The virus spreads by itself, but it had to be created. It was a lab-created virus, manufactured at the propaganda department and the KGB in Moscow. And then they had special agents who would plant those anti-American stories in the Western media in Europe, and then they would travel to the United States. And eventually it caught on so well that I can tell you a story about this famous political journalist who always lived in the United States and was telling us, the Soviets on TV, about how terrible life in America is. You know, how people live under this terrible oppression of rich capitalist pigs, and there is the people are impoverished, afraid to go out into the streets, and there was this police brutality. So if the criminals don't get them, the police would. And it was this dark existence, and he would usually find the most ugly place as a backdrop, like some garbage heap or something. And very few people actually believed that. You know, I was thinking, where in hell could he find those places? Or he had a really wild imagination to write those stories. But when I after having lived here a little, I realized that he didn't need to invent any stories. He could just translate the editorial from the New York Times. And that would be it. That was very easy. Then I also noticed how Americans, or in the media, the journalists were counting other people's money and deciding, trying to decide who should earn how much. And I thought, why would anybody in a capitalist system even think about that? Because that's the mentality of socialism. When everything is shared through the government, you have to look over other people's shoulders and see how much they're earning. Because if everything is shared, then you have to watch that others don't slack off. Because then you would be a fool to work harder than them. And then but you yourself would be inclined to slack off and live off somebody else's hard work. And that's also in human nature. And so that's why I think that system is basically immoral, because it kind of brings up the worst in people. So counting other people's money, and yes, you know, like I said, the system was anti-business. Therefore, whoever was making more money was oftentimes a criminal. You couldn't avoid that. Like there was this guy in Georgia who actually, there was like a big shocking story, like an expose in the media. He created an underground car factory. Can you imagine that? In a totalitarian country, creating a factory that produced Volgas, which were like the Russian version of Cadillac. It was like a Russian luxury car. So, of course, compared probably to like, I don't know, what's the cheapest car in America? That would be the Soviet luxury car. He was making those cars and selling them. So in order for him to make them, he could manufacture some of the parts. He couldn't make the engines himself, of course. Those parts were stolen from the government drum factories on the Volga, then in Russia, transported to Georgia. In order to do that, he had to pay off a whole lot of people. Then, in order to sell those cars, he needed to pay off the police, and so that they would turn the blind eye. So there was such a huge chain of corruption involved. And a lot of people went to jail, and that guy, the organizer of this, he was Georgian, went to Siberia for a very long prison term. And I thought, if he had lived somewhere in a capitalist society like in America, he would probably be a captain of industry. Because to have such a creative mind and being so full of energy, I would never pull anything like that, but he did. So he would, in a different society, would have a good life and actually contribute to other people's well-being by being creative and creating products. In the USSR, he went to jail. So most people who were better off than others, if they were not the party elite, they were criminals. And that was kind of understood. So being poor was considered moral. Being rich was considered immoral. And we were, because there was this corruption, the government eventually started encouraging people to be vigilant and watch what your neighbor was doing and your co-workers were doing, and if you see something, say something. But, so I was surprised why in America somebody would count other people's money. That was a sign of the advancing, I wouldn't call it socialism, I would rather call it collectivism. And what I wanted to also mention that there are different varieties of socialism, but I'll come to that later. Because what people throw around the word socialism a lot, but not all of what they mean when it's being meant is the classical Marxist way of studying socialism, because that idea, socialism exists in the book of Marx, like that idea is incorporated into his theory. But there were other versions of the story of the signs, the problem signs that I observed. Then my children went to to work, for instance. The right to work was written into the Constitution, then the government would have to be of So you had to contribute equally with everybody else. If you didn't work, you had to, like for a brief period of time it was tolerated, but a prolonged unemployment, deliberate unemployment was punished. You would get a visit from a local policeman, and they would tell you to show up at, well, first they will tell you to find a job. And all jobs were the government jobs. You had to work for the government. If you still didn't find a job, they would give one for you. And the government, because there was no market, they could create any number of jobs if needed, whether they were needed or not. So you would get a dispatch to a railroad station to unload like coal. They would tell you at 7 in the morning, 7 a.m., you have to be at the railroad station and work the full day there. Or you would, like at 6:30 in the morning, show up at the street corner and we'll give you a broom and you will be sweeping the streets. And if you don't show up then you're sent off to a re-education facility, the so-called labor therapy, which meant like hard labor camp, basically. So that's about the right to work. And then the right to free medical care. Again, the government would need to track you down in order to provide it to you. It would be obligated to give it to you. It would have to, where will it take the money to give it? It would have to tax you in order to give you this medical care. So the money would still be coming from your pocket. It's just that running through the government bureaucracy would become more expensive and inefficient. Then instead of being free owners of the country who are getting their services by paying out of their own pockets, choosing the services they want, people would then become dependents of the government and become beggars asking for a favor from a government bureaucrat, because the relationship between the citizen and the government would change for that purpose. And is it really worth it? And everything that the government does in bulk is of inferior quality and costs more money. So we would get something inefficient, of lower quality, and we will lose a lot of our freedoms that we currently have. For what? Then the right to education, the same thing. You don't choose what you want your children to learn. The government assigns the subjects, and the government decides what to teach your children, but it's free. And the housing, it was very cheap. It wasn't free, but the government gave you the apartments. You were lucky, of course, if you would get it quickly, because some people waited for 20 years in line. And while waiting, they were living with their parents. So there were sometimes like 3 generations of people living in the same apartment, a small apartment. And if you received an apartment, you couldn't choose in what area you wanted the apartment. You couldn't choose in what city. Whatever was available, you would get it, and you would be happy to have it, because other people had it even worse. So those are there is also the rights that the government would then be obliged to provide for you.